Well, obviously, it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without a little bit of technical difficulties, so I guess that's somewhat to be expected. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is our panel, The Future of the Gay Village. I wish we were in person. I'm sure I would have had a light show and lasers to underscore, the futuristic nature of what we're talking about. But unfortunately, given everything, we're doing this over Zoom, and that's just not possible this time around. So you heard a little bit about my two panelists here this afternoon. Julie Podmore, of course, a very distinguished affiliate assistant professor from Fordham University, who focuses on the geography, planning, and the environment, and Kristen Wong-tam, the first ever elected lesbian city councillor in the city of Toronto, and herself a former business owner on Church Street. So thank you both for joining me.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Now, obviously, we have a whole bunch to chat about, not too much time. I'm asking everyone to submit questions as we go through. I'm going to try to work them into the conversation rather than setting some time apart at the end. So just fire them off whenever it comes to your head, and I will take a look at them and try to incorporate them into the conversation. But maybe right off the top, given that it's so pertinent, so in the news, Kristen, I know that in the last couple of days you've come out with with initiative to defund the Toronto Police to the tune of about 10%, in line with what's being requested, across North America. Obviously that's going to have a huge impact on the village. Conversations around the level of policing have been very top of mind the last couple of years. Maybe you can just talk a little bit from the get-go about what that initiative means and what it could mean potentially for the village.
Yeah, no, Justin, thank you. And I appreciate the question and the opportunity to actually explain the intention of the motion. So the motion is to really direct and redirect resources that are currently going to the Toronto Police into underfunded service agencies and other sectors that could possibly be responding to police calls. So right now, if you are interacting with someone who may be having an episode of violence, of mental illness, you end up calling the police. Everyone is told to call the police, and the police officers will come out with almost armed intervention. So imagine a world where we're not calling the police on someone who's homeless and sleeping on a door stoop. Imagine that we are calling housing workers. Imagine that we would be able to call sorry, that was my phone. Imagine we were able to call mental health support workers. Imagine we were able to call somebody else that can do the first responder intervention and not necessarily always the police. And we recognize that we do need police officers, and our frontline officers who work in the village are exceptional. I know that they do some very difficult and challenging work. So the call for myself and Councillor Matlow is not that we're dismantling the police or abolishing the police. We appreciate the services that the police offer, and we want to invest in those services that we need. But we also think that there's an opportunity to reinvest and redirect resources to underfunded social agencies to keep communities safer from a different point of view.
Now, obviously, through the history of villages right across North America and the world, policing has always been a really thorny issue. In Montreal, Julie, where I know you are, the city police were instrumental in I'm going to use really aggressive scare quotes here, cleaning up the red light district and parts of the village and clearing out some of the bars, some of the encampments, some of the folks who lived there. So, maybe you can talk a little bit about, how that is the sort of intersecting with the conversations that are going on right now in terms of defunding or changing the role of police.
That makes me think of many things. I'm glad in many ways that we began this way today, because the story of gay villages is a story of relationships with police, and maybe the story of the future of the gay village is tangentially linked to the defunding of the police. Maybe Kristen will have a lot more to say about that than me. But I mean, certainly, police surveillance is what led to the formation of and the displacement of gay consumer spaces in Montreal, because they used to be originally in the red light district and in the downtown core. But many of the raids around the 1976 Olympics ended up displacing them and moving them to into the east, into the Faubourg de Malas, which is where the gay village is found today. So policing is integral in that. And when we're going to be talking more about the future, I think, of the gay village, I'm going to be suggesting that one of the most important things is the augmentation of the institutionalization of gay village spaces. And I think it's very strongly linked to social services and the decrease in policing in gay villages. So,
yeah. And you've certainly picked up on kind of where I want to start with all of this, which is ironically the past of the gay village. Because I don't think we can talk really effectively about the future until we kind of get a grasp on some of that. And in a lot of cases, it hasn't been well conveyed or understood in the public. Even in Toronto, famously, the village didn't start on Church Street. It was on Yonge Street, and it was sort of, again, I'm using these aggressive scare quotes, cleaned up, in partnership with City Council and partnership with the police. So, Kristen, maybe we can go to that idea of institutionalization. I think in the past we've seen that villages tend to be very non-permanent, that they can be moved pretty quickly if the city or the police are interested in doing so. So, are there ways in which we can, looking back, we can cement those businesses, those storefronts, those community centers, those homes, especially given the lessons we've learned from, the 60s, 70s to today.
Mm-hmm. And that's the big question for all urban planners, for anybody who studies cities and neighborhoods, is how do you actually retain the cultural authenticity of a neighborhood? And that is oftentimes coming out of people and the activities that take place in the spaces. So for me, there's a conversation around the brick and mortar. Where are these activities housed? Do we get to do our social activities and our animation on the street, in the laneways, in the parks? And I think it's safe to say that wherever gay people come together and we designate a space as safe, and we come together for social cohesion, to meet up, to hook up, or whatever it is, it's there we create the village. It's there we actually create those cultural activities that people have been talking about literally for decades. How do you define it? How do you contain it? And how do you preserve it and expand it and export it? And the challenge here, I think, has always been is that we seem to have limited ourselves to a physical area of the city. And we know that, not even just in Toronto, it's like literally around the world, there is this conversation that's been taking place, not just within the last 5 years, it's literally within decades, probably with the advent of equal marriage becoming a sanctioned right by state. It is probably, we can't talk about what happens with gay connections without talking about the dozen social media apps that are out there for allow us to meet and find each other in different ways. So I think that we need to be able to explore the cultural activity and values that we produce as human beings, as gay people, and be able to unpack what that means in the neighborhood built in environment and context. I can speak to that a little bit further, but certainly that is always the one piece that I feel that has been missing from every conversation from the year 1990s onward to 2000, 2010, 2020, as we explore the dying of the villages, and whether it's Boys Town and in Chicago or Greenwich Village, everybody is having the same conversation, including those in the iconic Castro district. But the activity we produce and what we're doing has moved into other neighborhoods, and gay people are in some ways, flourishing, just because the safe space has expanded so broadly.
Yeah, and Julie, maybe you can talk a bit, because I know you've written a lot about the sort of diffusion of the village and the queering of the suburbs. So looking back, I know part of that was by necessity, like you point out. Police raids and police actions have necessitated that to some degree, but some of it is voluntary. Looking back, from as far back as you can go in the village, people were deciding to camp to the suburbs. So maybe you can just give us a little bit of that, the wider history of why people have left and what that sort of has done to the spaces around the village.
This is a very big question.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry.
I guess I'll start with one of the things, one element that we see occurring in terms of urban studies is the formation of alternate neighborhoods. So what we're calling gay-friendly or queer-friendly neighborhoods in the urban studies literature. So, for example, in Toronto, I think there are maybe a few of those neighborhoods that are really quite visible now. Usually old lesbian neighborhoods. They tend to be like Brooklyn, or here in Montreal, Mile End or Parkdale, etc. And so I think that's a good place to start, because in many ways, those neighborhoods brought together those people who maybe didn't necessarily always feel a strong identification with the gay village, like historically women and other populations. And then in my most recent research, because of land costs and because of the incredible diversification of the LGBT population, I mean, we are now, many of us are parents. There's an incredible diversity in terms of income and other forms of identity, and that means that those places are getting shaped in other locations throughout the metropolitan area. So most of my research on suburbs has been in Vancouver, where, of course, queer populations are being displaced from the downtown core, and you have dense networks of queer community forming in Surrey, in New Westminster, in Burnaby, and they bring some elements of the gay village with them, and they work with that in the suburban environment. It creates very interesting new kinds of ways of occupying space and different regroupings of people as well. I hope I answered that question. I could get really carried away on that topic.
Yeah, that I mean, you're more than invited to get carried away. So, maybe we've already jumped from policing to sort of demographics, but maybe an important question is sort of what exactly is the village, right? We in the past it's been areas where queer people have lived, and then it sort of took on a shape of bars springing up that cater to queer people and then queer-owned businesses, but these days, it's awfully hard to open up a shop on Church Street. It's pretty expensive. Some of the bars are shutting down. Folks are kind of more far-flung geographically. So, in this time and age, we're in the present now. What really constitutes a village? Maybe Kristen, you can lead off on that one.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and it's one that I stumbled into the village myself in 1987. That's when I came out of the closet. The village was my home. It was my sanctuary. I was a teenager, but I was also a homeless teenager, and I found my sense of community and chosen family there. So I will always say there will always be a need for a gay village. I strongly feel that in the bottom of my heart, is that we need to have a space that we can call our own, point to, because the social acceptance that is here today, those were hard-fought civil rights, and we may not always have them, depending on who's in power and what political forces are at work in the world and in houses of government. So I really think that when it comes to defining the village, and I'm going to define it geographically, just as 125 businesses that sit in the catchment area of the Church and Wellesley Village, and it sort of spanned over about 5 blocks. And so where is that village today? It's right on Church Street from Gloucester on the north side to Wood Street on the south. But if I take a look at the catchment area of where people are, and if we take a look at walkable neighborhoods, then we probably will say the village could go right over to Bay Street and right over to possibly Sherbourne, as far north as Davenport or even Bloor, and as far south as possibly even Dundas, where Young Dundas Square is. And so it really depends on where people are, but I will say the village right now, for short strokes and for convenience to define, is about 5 city blocks and 125 businesses. And then around that is about 100,000 people that live within that area. And that population balloons out with massive commuter people who travel into the area to work, and then it goes to 3 times. So as someone who has lived in the village, who has supported the village, who's actually owned and operated a business in the village, I know that it is not easy making payroll. Rents in Toronto, not just the village, but right across the city, especially in the downtown core, are expensive. And I think that there's oftentimes this conception that the village rents are more expensive, and it is not necessarily true. But I have noticed that in my time as a business owner, I used to own Timothy's World Coffee from the year 2000 to 2007. it was also the year that the Maple Leaf Gardens shut down. And that was about 16,000 people that would basically come into the venue. They would shop, they would eat, they would leave, and money would be left on the village streets and on the bars and restaurants, and then they would go. For 10 years, Maple Leaf Gardens tiled their doors, and it went dark before we saw the Loblaws reopen. And for those 10 years, where we didn't have any major big shop anchors, and the CBC had then also left the village, because they used to have offices in the village along and as well as Jarvis Street, so that commuter base of workers also left. And my observation between the year 2000 2007 while I was there as an operator is that there was a nighttime activity of business owners, bars and restaurants, and then there was the daytime activity, and the two didn't always meet. They didn't always have the same type of social coherence. And so we were sort of left to our own, those who were gay tailored businesses, and then those who sort of did their business activity during the daytime and then went home. And then a lot of the gay activity happened on the dance floors. They happened Thursday, Friday, Saturday, maybe Sunday, but Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they went dark. And that has always been this wonderful cacophony of businesses on Church Street. And over the years, as people have diversified where they go to entertain, where they go to hook up, where they go to eat, the village is not always the first choice. And I run into folks all the time who I used to see in the village, because I'm a counselor of a bigger area, and they're not dining in the village. And I know that they actually walk right past the village to go dine in Yorkville or to dine, closer to King Street. And so that continues to be the story, and that story will constantly be evolving.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, the village being a victim of a bit of its own success, but at the same time, the part of the sensibility of a village is that that's what you're there for. That's what you're going to. There's some rule in economics. I'm sure it has a good name. That the best place, if you want to compete with a local taco shop, the best place to open up is right next door to them, not across town, because that neighborhood has a demand for tacos. So Julie, you've studied this, this sort of decentralization of the village. Has it helped or hurt the queer communities in those cities? Are cities better off by trying to create a bunch of micro villages around the city, or is that central one more effective?
Okay, I have many answers, many things to say.
Give us at least three.
I will start by saying that I agree with Kristen that I think the village will always need a village in a certain way. Like I do think it's a very important symbolic space, but maybe whom it is important for is constantly shifting and changing, and I think there will perhaps always be an importance of the village for certain groups of youth, for people migrating to the city. So like, for example, here in Quebec, Montreal's gay village represents this opportunity to be out and so on and so forth. And when people get there, maybe it doesn't feel exactly like what they thought it would feel like, but it plays that role, and that's important. Unfortunately, this village, Montreal's gay village, has very little institutional infrastructure. And I think that makes it quite different than in Toronto. It has, for example, the community center isn't anywhere near the St. Catherine Street. You probably even have thought to yourself, maybe there isn't a community center because it's very, very invisible. And so there hasn't been that emphasis here in Montreal on building up an institutional infrastructure that will stimulate and support those businesses. And furthermore, one of the things that's starting to happen, I think this is interesting given what Kristen said regarding CBC, Radio-Canada has just closed their property right below the gay village, and it's going to be redeveloped as a residential community. Historically, those workers, though, were the people who went into the village and dined in all the restaurants and all that kind of thing. So there's a big transition occurring with that. And another very large complex is currently undergoing redevelopment. It was called the Complexe Bourbon, and it was a hotel and many different restaurants and all those kinds of things, and it was gay oriented. But now it is part of a major redevelopment scheme, and a lot of people believe that if that scheme is developed, that will sort of be the end of the village. There's this feeling of the incredible fragility of Montreal's village, And that is because there aren't that many gay businesses there anymore. There's lots of like A&W. There's lots of very mainstream kinds of businesses in Montreal's gay village, which is a very distinct change maybe from 10 years ago. And when you have businesses like that there, the idea of like, what would be the purpose to go to that place really changes, because those are things you could find anywhere in the city, I suppose.
Well, and Kristen, so, if you're seeing some of these businesses leave or be unable to stay above the water or can't make rent every month, we're seeing this right now. Obviously, with the pandemic, we've seen business after business come out and say, we're struggling. You've seen some places go to condos. You've seen some places just finally throw in the towel and say, we can't take any more losses. What do you do about that on the city level, provincial level, federal level, what have you, business association level? Michael is in the comments asking, what do you actually need to do to either make it easier to stay afloat or make it easier to open up a business? And we also have a question here from Bruce saying, there's economic development agencies for women, for Indigenous communities, for other minority groups. Could something like that have a factor in helping queer people, young people, what have you, open up a business on Church Street?
Those are excellent questions, and it is actually something that I think cities, not just Toronto, but cities around the world have been struggling with, because gay communities have not oftentimes been seen as a group that you need to foster economic development for. So there are definitely programs for Indigenous people, for women, as you've noted, and those are great. However, when it comes to fostering LGBT business development, I have struggled, and we've done the research because I was trying to look for other best examples around the world on, number one, how do we promote and preserve the culture that we have in the village? We take a look at the physical activity that people are talking about, but also we needed to figure out how do we preserve those buildings and whether or not the buildings met the heritage criteria for designation. And in so many ways, and I have to say, we did the research. I had folks help me find, actively look, where else in the world have they been able to figure this out? And there is no great example. And it seems to me there is, at this point in time, and it's happening, but I'm seeing these conversations emerge in the Castro, which is why I kind of know what's going on there, as well as, also in Greenwich Village in New York, is that their gay villages are struggling with exactly the same things that we are struggling with, is how do you preserve businesses? How do you foster business activity? How do you ask governments to open up their coffers to give you a special non-repayable grant to keep your private for-profit business afloat because you serve a cultural need? And it is, that's not necessarily the easiest program to design, but I can say, and I think I'm very happy that it's happening, is that the City of Toronto has, or Council has adopted a motion of mine that specifically is looking at how do we drive economic prosperity into the neighborhood, specifically to preserve LGBT cultural spaces. So we don't have necessarily our own museums, but we do have the archives, which is great. But our cultural activity happens on the dance floors. It used to happen in the bushes and Allen Gardens and Queens Park. That was cultural activity. Let's own that. But our cultural activity happens in gay coffee shops. It happens on what used to be the steps of the Second Cup. All of those things have changed, and the revitalization or gentrification forces has forced the conversation around in ways that have been somewhat, I would say, directionless. The village in Toronto has a special character designation, and so anything that is being proposed for redevelopment has to meet the special character of the village. But that only speaks to built form, the height, the street wall, the angular plane. If you ask me, does that make a village? A village with a cultural activity, with sexual liberation politics? I would say no, but those are the planning tools and the municipal tools that we had, and getting to the cultural preservation of cultural spaces in private businesses has been really the big puzzle that we haven't sorted out. But I'm happy that the city is doing the work. And since I moved that motion on the floor of council, which was adopted in January, and we've been working on it for some time, We've actually had other communities reach out to us saying, we're going to keep an eye on what Toronto is doing because we're struggling with the same problem in Ottawa. Got the same problem in Vancouver. So, keep us apprised on what that development will look like.
And Julie, let me ask you. Let me flip that a little bit. Beyond just the sort of traditional business, levers, Montreal has tried something a bit different to create a bit more of an outdoor space. The bureaus that hang over the street, shutting down the street to pedestrian traffic, putting in art installations. You tend to, even if there are, a line of A&Ws, you tend to see people in the street hanging out on park benches, hanging outside. Javier is in our comments kind of saying, what about concepts, camping, concerts, events that actually bring people to these physical spaces, maybe beyond just the traditional brick and mortar businesses? Is there a path forward? Has that sort of thing been effective?
Okay, so I think something really important to discuss here is who is representing the village at City Hall. And what kind of urban planning is being proposed? So, for example, earlier you mentioned that Montreal has sort of engaged more in urban planning. I wouldn't say that. I think that Montreal has engaged in the festivalization of public space through art, which is, an interesting thing. It does attract people to those spaces, but it also leads concomitantly to the privatization of those spaces in a certain way. That has been very difficult in Montreal in terms of who feels they are allowed to be in those festivalized spaces. There's been a really big increase in policing those spaces. And that's really where some of the lines have been drawn between the various communities that now identify with places elsewhere, for example. And so the way that we have represented villages in city politics, for the most part, the main actor is the BIA, right? The Business Improvement Association represents the street, who then sort of represents this sort of city of neighborhoods kind of formulation in urban planning. But I think it needs to be more than that. And I would love to hear what Kristen has to say about that. I think that might be one of the issues or one of the problems, that there needs to be more than just business people speaking for the gay village. And certainly that's not the case in Toronto because you are the counselor for that neighborhood. But that's not the case in Montreal, for example.
Yeah, and actually, I'd be curious because in Toronto, you don't have that closed space. I mean, you have a big boulevard, which is Church Street. There's not a lot of outdoor spaces to sit and have a picnic or hang out with friends. You tend to have to go inside to a private business. So notwithstanding all the very valid criticisms of Montreal's village, is Toronto's is there something we can do about Toronto to maybe bridge that gap and find a middle ground between the two?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great segue here, because St. Catherine in Montreal is the equivalent, I would say, to our main street on Yonge Street, which, interestingly enough, Justin, you noted at the very beginning of your remarks, is that was the original village. That's where all the gay activity was, whether it's St. Charles Street Tavern or all the different other types of bars that were there. And we have seen the loss of those gay dance spaces, including Kobe's and Chaps, which used to be on Isabella, and the Chamois that was on Hayden Street. So these become the streets that are linear as well as perpendicular, and that is what the formation of the village was, because people would traverse through the different blocks, and that's along the way they would shop and they would interact and they would dine and they would find safety. So the village was much, much larger just by that definition. But where we are in Toronto today is that there has been a siloing effect, largely because of what Julie has said in terms of voices left only to business associations. And for sure, Toronto has very strong BIAs, and the BIA that sits on Church Street is definitely sitting between giants, Bloor Yorkville in the north, downtown Yonge in the south, and they don't really have a cousin that's directly next to them. But those are multi-million-dollar business districts with much larger staff deployment than what Church and Wellesley has. What we need to I think take advantage of, even though COVID-19 has been devastating for the economy because of the induced lockdown recession, I think we need to repurpose our public space and make sure that our recovery as gay people, as queer people, as people who love to eat out and dine out and to be with one another, we need to embed our economic recovery in those public spaces, because we know that the rates of transmission locally are going to be minimized by doing outdoor activity. And we have always been, I think, outdoor people. So if we can actually take advantage of what I know are to be programs that are coming out right across the city, but we make it distinctly ours for the village. So we could, remove some of those cars that aren't really adding much economic value to the street life, if you ask me. We repurpose all that public space without making some very big construction heavy, expensive, arduous process, but we start to drop in patios and furniture, and we put in a dance floor, we put in a stage, and we allow people to socially distance, come and enjoy the food and beverages. Do not bring in third-party outside vendors. That is always a mistake of pride. I never liked it when I was a merchant on the street, because you parachute something in front of my shop. And at the same time, I've been serving the community for all those years. But I think if we take advantage of what I think is coming, which is the Cafe TO culture, based on the COVID-19 recovery programs for main streets, but we make it distinctly the village, totally brand it and make it bigger and more fabulous than anywhere else, we become a destination again. And if we're going to attract those gay dollars and the gay people back into the neighborhood, then we're going to have to be competitive. I used to say that Toronto had to compete with New York and Chicago. Now I know it's main streets in different neighborhoods that will have to compete for those dollars now in the new COVID-19 environment. And all of a sudden, the village can be competitive from that vantage point.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just really briefly, Kristen, there are organizations, we mentioned the archives earlier. There are organizations and there are groups around the village that don't really have they're offering services, don't have the same sort of business lens as some of the others do. How do you end up supporting them, especially as rents go up, as their donor base and their government grants are kind of frozen in time, but their costs are increasing? What do you do for something like the archives? What do you do if somebody comes along and says, I want to open up a not-for-profit shelter for trans youth, or I want to open up this or that, or a space for sober folks who don't want to go into the bar culture? What do you is there something there? Is there a support that can exist for those people?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think this is where nonprofit organizations, not just the gay ones, but every small nonprofit and charity has been struggling because of COVID. The donor base has definitely shrunk, especially as the demand for service has increased. For the archives, one of their challenges has been, do you base it on the value of foot traffic? Do you base it on the loaning out of collections? Do you base it on web views? And how do you measure success? And as an organization, which I really support, but as an organization that sits kind of outside of the city purview, is how do we support an organization that doesn't always have a direct city relationship? So we support the Toronto Public Libraries because that is definitely an asset and a public service that we have to put out. It has a board of directors that responds to the City of Toronto and it's approved by the budget. So there are a number of these smaller groups that I think we need to figure out how do we provide better supports. But the big cultural dollars are not always, to be quite honest, within the City of Toronto. Quebec is a great example. Big cultural dollars go to Quebec. Big cultural dollars don't always come to Ontario. But the archives is a national institution. It is a national lesbian and gay archive. Why are they not receiving national dollars, even if they are located in Toronto? If the AGO or the ROM is getting those big national dollars and big Ontario dollars, why would something like the archives, which I believe is so valuable to our community because they're our story keepers, why are they not receiving those national dollars? And if they are, then go give them more because they're clearly not enough. The City of Toronto has given them a building which they sit on and they own. I have released some Section 37 dollars, which I have discretion to do, to make their space wheelchair accessible and to provide better access and respect the heritage building that they're in. But operating dollars are very different, and usually it's the federal and provincial government that steps in with that. And even if the city was to kick in some operating dollars, it is somewhat limited for what I believe is a national treasure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And And Julie, maybe we can jump off that too in terms of especially the federal role, especially in terms of cultural institutions.
Now we're on a topic that I forgot to sort of say that I'm involved in as well, because I was formerly a part of the Quebec Gay Archives, and now I'm involved in launching the Lesbian Archives of Quebec. So, I mean, these archives were created as an alternate to being part of the National Archives. So there's a whole Canadian politics embedded in that. But what I can say is that they are so marginal from any funding by any funding bodies in Quebec or nationally speaking that it's very, very difficult. They base, like, for example, the Quebec Gay Archives bases its entire funding on donations from ordinary people. Like, they don't have any funding. And yet they are right in the village. They're one of the few institutions that's right there in the Montreal Gay Village. So I think in our case, bringing together many of these institutions and working much harder on bringing in funding for them and setting that up is a really crucial thing in Montreal's village, for sure.
But and Julie, let me ask you. We talked a fair bit about Toronto, Montreal, a bit about Vancouver. We haven't really touched on Ottawa, Quebec City, Halifax, so on. But these are the villages that are probably going to get hit the hardest. I mean, Halifax. Halifax had its kind of somewhat famous Pink Triangle in the North End. That was a collection of small businesses, and the last of which just died over the course of COVID-19. Men's and Molly's Bar was the last dedicatedly queer bar in Halifax, and it's gone under. I think a lot of other cities are not just at risk of seeing their villages decline, but disappear altogether. What happens at that point when entire cities are just bereft of their queer queer spaces?
I don't have a really good answer for that, but what I could say maybe is I could compare it to what I've seen in suburban areas where there are new things, like smaller cities, more peripheral places, more suburban. There are new things going on in those locations. And so, when a smaller city like Halifax loses it all, I mean, I don't give up hope, because I think there still will be something created by queer people that are living there. But maybe that historic element may be lost. And that might be the future of our gay villages as well, that the historic element is probably, I mean, most of the village bars that I knew in the 1990s in Montreal, they're pretty much all gone now. And they've been replaced by other things. And their actual numbers are very much reduced, and there's a broader mix of kinds of businesses and services. But I think that like Amin Ghaziani, like, the village will stay. The village it has a future, but it's a different future than what it looked like before. We're not going to be able to reproduce its centrality, the mix of different things that were there. We're going to have to think of it as the center, as he proposes, of an archipelago that's connected to many different other kinds of spaces, like the queer-friendly neighborhoods, like new community centers growing up in the suburbs that for queer youth that are connected to the downtown. And we're going to think of it maybe more in terms of networks than we are as being so centralized. Anyway, that was my riff.
No, that's great. I mean, that kind of segues us into our last couple of minutes. I mean, Kristen, maybe we can start with you. I want to hear a bit about what you think the future of the village could be. Let's assume that you have the levers in your power are suddenly available to pull, and you are able to sort of kind of wield the power of not just the city, but the province, the federal government, so on. How do you think the future of the village could look if you sort of had that power?
Wow, I mean, if I had that power, which I don't, but I would probably designate it as a UNESCO site. I am biased, I have to say. It's because the village was my sanctuary. So I would like that village to exist for years and decades and generations after I'm gone, so that people will be able to see that they have a space in Toronto carved up for their own. I know that will probably not meet the qualifications of a UNESCO site, but you said if I had the powers. But really what we're hoping for, and what I really believe is necessary, is that we need people to actually talk positively about the village. The number of times, and actually now I have a few decades under my belt, I have now lived through the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, where every year there is this article that comes out about the death of the village, and so whether it's Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver or wherever, and then we rehash the same conversations literally all over again. I know Julia's laughing and smiling because she knows what I'm talking about, and yet it is literally the same conversation. But really, at the end of the day, what we need to do is come and shop, and we need to allow those spaces to be, which includes dance spaces. We are sometimes nocturnal creatures, and before I had my son, who's 1 year old, but I was a regular nighttime, night crawler in the village, and I've done that for a good number of years, and there's a whole generation behind me that I think, if given the opportunity and encouraged and told that they belong, then they can also do that for themselves. And so for the longevity of the village, we need to support it. We need to sing its attributes. We need to go shopping there. The number of times I've run into the boys at Loblaws, and I'm like, I know you love the village, but you're shopping at Loblaws, and that tells me that no dollars are going to Pusateri, no dollars were going to our local, local food shops, because you're buying everything at Loblaws. The number of times I've been invited to gay galas, fundraisers for major AIDS organizations, they are never in the village. They're at the Four Seasons Hotel, they're Ritz-Carlton, they're at the Drake, they're at wherever, but they're never in the village. And when I ask them, just gently ask the executive directors, why don't you hold events in the village? What can we do to bring you into the village? And they will say, well, we're not, our people don't want to go there. I've actually asked film festivals, can you host movie in the park, all the favorite gay flicks, let's do it. Can I close down the street for you? And they will tell me, these are our film festivals, right? They will say, we're going to go elsewhere. Trinity Bell Woods, we're going to go to, David Pico Square, we're going to go to Young Dundas Square. Our institutions are not even supporting the village. So if we want this village to survive and prosper, which I believe it can, then we're going to have to go and do that ourselves.
And Julie, I'll kind of ask you the same question before we leave. But you want the opportunity to change the future. But especially from a city planning, from an urbanist point of view, I mean, are there other things we can do to kind of continue building these out, or fostering them, or creating new ones, or preserving the old ones? And so what sort of levers does that look like?
Well, I'm really learning from listening to the way that Kristen frames these things. And what I think is really interesting is to think about, like, what kind of relationships could we build between those institutions and, for example, the BIA? Like, could we build stronger connections between them? Could we create bylaws where there needs to be an institution if there's a new urban redevelopment or something? Because I think the two go together. Like, there's not going to be a gay village without bars and dancing and all those things that we were talking about. But I think that the ebbs and flows in the economy impact bars and so on. But institutions will stay there, and they'll bring people there. And I understand that in Toronto, maybe you have that good institutional base, but I would love to know how to build that in, for example, Montreal's village. We don't have that, no.
Okay, I think that's it for time for us. I'm relatively that's fine. It's relatively sure. I think my only last question is, where are you getting your haircut these days? Because I am desperately in need. Have you figured that out? Because I certainly haven't. Anyway, I think it looks good.
I did it myself.
Oh wow! Okay, well,
and the results were disastrous.
I'm very, very impressed. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Yeah, I didn't get to everyone's questions, but I tried to incorporate a bunch of them. Anyway, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your sessions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Nice to meet you.
Bye.
You too. Take care, everyone. Be well.